So last week was Easter. I don't know about you, it feels like a month ago. It was a long week for us. But last week was Easter, and we discussed why we believe in the resurrection of Jesus. Because the resurrection is what matters. Everything about our faith, everything that we believe hinges on whether Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus stayed dead, then our faith is useless. But if Jesus rose from the dead, then the whole world is different. The whole world has been changed. There is a hope that we have for eternity. We have forgiveness of sins. That means the death that Jesus died on the cross was not a cruel tragedy, but it fulfilled the purpose of God in this world. The resurrection is what gives meaning to the cross. Without the resurrection, it was just a young man who died way too young. But the resurrection shows that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Lord, the King, and that this is our Father's world. So last week we looked at why do we believe that the resurrection is true? Because the claim that we make, the claim that we are staking our life on is an incredible thing to say. That a man executed 2,000 years ago is not only alive today, but he is on the throne of God, reigning over all of creation. I mean, there's no way to understate how incredible that claim is. And so last week we looked at, to put it in the simplest terms possible, the reason we believe is because of the eyewitness testimony of those who were there, of those who saw Jesus alive. And we have that eyewitness testimony in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know, Mark and Luke were not necessarily there, but they interviewed the eyewitnesses who were there. And the early church considered that to be just as good as the original eyewitness testimony of Matthew and John. And so we have those. We also have the writings of Paul, who at different points in his letters talks about his own eyewitness testimony. So we have these witnesses that who all claim that Jesus is alive. And because he's Lord, we're all going to have to stand before him one day and give an account for our lives. So it makes us consider what kind of lives that we're going to live. And just like that song, I had the word battle that I wanted to talk about. In that song that we just sang, "This is my Father's world," the battle is not done. And that is so true, isn't it? Do we see evidence of the battle that's waging in our own lives, the battle that's going on out in the world? Because when Jesus showed up with the kingdom of God, the kingdom of this world and the ruler of this world, the devil did not want to go quietly and is still fighting in desperation to hold on to whatever power or whatever, any way to mess up the lives of God's people. And so that battle is still happening in our lives. And we see that, we feel that. One part of that battle is that you're going to come across people who are actually your enemies. There are people out there who are not neutral to you, that they are in fact enemies. Paul would call them enemies of the cross. There are people out there, and they're kind of like evangelists against Jesus. They have an agenda. Their goal is to drag people away from the faith. Typically, you will find them at universities. That's kind of where they tend to work, is at university. So if you're going to one, or you're sending your kids or grandkids to one, that is, you have to be on guard. You have to be on guard, because that's where the biggest influence is at right now, with people trying to undermine the faith. But even if you don't, you still are going to come across it. You just watching the news. Sometimes they interview these people. You're just flipping through, different stories on the internet. You're going to come across these things, and we're going to look at some of the arguments that are made today of people who are trying to undermine the faith, and why they say that you can't trust the Gospels, that you can't trust the resurrection stories. And so if you haven't come across these yet, you probably will. Your family members might. And so if you're not prepared for it, it might shake you, because these people are so confident in how they talk. There's a lot of vibrato, and just they are not afraid to belittle Christians and to try to make, they try to make Christians feel ashamed, like their faith is stupid. They're not afraid to do personal attacks. And so if you're not prepared for that, it might shake you. It might rattle you. And so it's important to understand kind of where they're coming from, what some of these arguments are. And it probably won't surprise you that in some ways it will remind you of the serpent in the garden. Did God really say? Can you really trust these documents that have been handled by so many people over thousands of years? Can you really trust them? It's going to sound a lot like the serpent in the garden. One thing that they'll say is, these documents, did they write them down like within the weeks and months after the crucifixion of Jesus? Did they write down these stories? Well, no. As far as we can tell, they didn't write it down immediately. As far as we can tell, the people who study this, within 20 to 40 years after the resurrection of Jesus, were these stories written down, at least in their final form. Maybe they wrote them down in kind of a rough draft form before that, but we don't know those things. But as far as we can guess, within 20 to 40 years, they're writing down these stories. And so they're saying, well, can you really trust that though? I mean, if you're reading documents that were written decades later after the crucifixion of Jesus, how can you be sure they're accurate? That's a long time. But let's think about human experience for a second. Just general observations about how God made us. Because they're belittling human memory. Now, if you ask me to remember just a random day from 20, 25 years ago, you just picked a random day, could I tell you what I was doing then? Maybe generally I could tell you what city I lived in, but if you ask me to tell me the details of the day on September 11th, 2001, I could tell you what that day looked like from the moment I woke up. That was 25 years ago. I could tell you all about that day. Why? God has made it so that the days that are important to us, the days that were life-changing for us, those stick with us. Those memories, we hang on to those days, don't we? If you've been married 40, 50, 60 years ago, can you tell me about your wedding day? Yeah, why? Because the most important days I'm not going to test you. I'm not going to test anybody again. But yeah, the most important days, the days that are life-changing, we remember those days. Even if it was 60 years ago, we can still tell you what happened those days. If you're telling me about your wedding day from 60 years ago, am I going to say, are you really sure about that? No, because you were there. That day was life-changing for you. Of course you're going to remember it. You could tell me what you were wearing. You could tell me you could tell me who else was there. You could tell me what you ate that day. You could give me all kinds of details about that day, right? It's no different for the people who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. This is the most life-changing day in their life. Bigger than their wedding, bigger than anything else they ever experienced. Of course they're going to remember it. They never stopped thinking about it. They never stopped talking about it. Do you think these apostles, do you ever think they were allowed to go 1 week without somebody saying, okay, I got to hear it again. Tell me about that day. Do you think there's 1 week of their life where they didn't tell the story of them seeing Jesus alive? There's no way. It would have been mandatory every Sunday. All right, Peter, we got to hear it again. I got to hear it again. I want to. They told it every week. They never stopped thinking about it. It was the most important day in their life. Yes, you can, even if it was written down decades later. Of course, we can trust it. That's one argument that you're going to hear over and over again. Well, the skeptics who are historians who are trying to undermine the faith, they look at how Christianity started, and they're like, okay, we've got a problem here. How do we explain the rise of Christianity without God being involved? That's their goal. They want to explain how the church got started if there's no God. That's how they want to look at the puzzle. So they look at the stories of Jesus, the resurrection, and they think, okay, well, maybe Jesus didn't really die on the cross. There's the swoon theory. Anybody ever heard of the swoon theory before? That Jesus, he passed out on the cross. He looked like he was dead. They brought him down from the cross, but he wasn't really dead. And they put him in the tomb, and he popped out 3 days later, alive. Hey, It's not too hard to poke holes in that, though, is it? It's actually, out of all of the different things we're going to cover today, this is actually considered now the worst possible theory among the skeptics, even. Let's look at this. So, go to John chapter 20. John chapter 20. If you are going to make the argument that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, this requires a couple different things. The biggest one is that the Roman soldiers would have let that happen in the first place. So you consider Roman soldiers executing a criminal. What would happen to them if they let a criminal who's supposed to be executed go free? They would take their place, wouldn't they? There's no way these Roman soldiers, this is not their first rodeo, right? This is not their first crucifixion that they've done. They were trained to do this. They were experts on this. Some of them, I'm guessing, enjoyed it, enjoyed the torture. It's just, there's no way they would have let somebody live. It's just, it's really, you would have to make all kinds of assumptions about the Roman soldiers that were there that day that just would be kind of fantastic. It's for a Roman soldier, his life is on the line here. If your life is on the line, would you leave any doubt at all whether you would take someone down from the cross who was still alive? You wouldn't let there be any doubts. And part of this argument, it plays to the fact that we don't understand death. We're not around it as much as they were back then. You figure the average lifespan back then was about 40 years. Death was a constant thing for them. And they didn't hire somebody to take care of the body afterwards. The family and the friends took care of it. They knew what it was like. They knew when a person was dead and when a person was just gravely injured. You think about what happens when Jesus is on the cross. We know that he died before the others, and his heart stopped beating. Well, what happens to all the blood? Gravity pulls it down. There's discoloration that happens. There's, we know that, just the natural things that happen in the body, that they would have been present. They would have begun with Jesus. And then we know from the eyewitnesses, what did the soldiers do when they came to Jesus? They took the spear. Yeah, they're not leaving any doubt here. They took the spear and they shoved it into his side. And out came water and blood. They're not leaving any doubt whether Jesus could have been alive. Now let's look at John chapter 20, verse 24. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, Didymus means twin, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hand, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you've seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus says, you are blessed today because you believe, even though you haven't seen him alive. So what is it that causes Thomas to stop doubting, and not just stop doubting, but makes what looks like to be the first claim of the deity of Jesus? He calls Jesus my Lord and my God. To my knowledge, no one had called Jesus my God yet. This is the first time someone does that. What would cause Thomas to do that? The resurrection. Because we understand that resurrection is not just, it wasn't like Lazarus where he just came back alive. He was fully healed. His body had been changed. His body had been transformed from a state of mortality to a state of immortality, where his body before could be destroyed. Now his body is indestructible, which, by the way, Paul goes on to say, Jesus is the blueprint for our future resurrection. If you want to understand what the future body is going to be like, look at the body of Jesus at the resurrection. That Paul goes 1 Corinthians 15, Philippians chapter 3. Paul goes into some more detail there. But just think with me. If Jesus, if we're going to play along with that theory, if Jesus had not died on the cross, but he just passed out, they put him in the tomb, he comes out 3 days later, hobbling up to the disciples, wounds, weeping, barely alive, infection setting in. Would Thomas have said, "My Lord and my God"? Thomas would have said, "You look terrible. Jesus, we need to get you to a doctor." Thomas would not have been in amazement. Thomas would have been, I think you're still about to die. The stories would have been different. The disciples would not have been in awe. The disciples would not have been shocked. They would have been, let's get you to a doctor. Your wounds you're in bad shape. If you're somehow still alive after that, the infections are going to take you. So it would not have caused them to say, "There's a miracle." They would have said, "Wow, I don't know how you escaped." It would have been a completely different story. It wouldn't have made them think, "Oh, God raised you from the dead." It would have made them think, "Well, that was a crazy accident that happened." So their whole worldview would have been completely different if Jesus had showed up just recently crucified and he still hasn't even been healed yet. It's only been 3 days. But Jesus shows up and he's changed. He still has the scars, which is an incredible thought to think. He still has the scars. But but he is in such a glorified state. Thomas just says, "My Lord and my God," when he sees him. However Jesus looked, they had to worship. When they saw Jesus, they worshiped him. A wounded Jesus would not cause them to worship him. So I think we can put that's actually considered the weakest of the theories. I think we can put that one to rest. Go to Matthew chapter 28. Matthew chapter 28. We're going to be in verse 11. Matthew 28, verse 11. So the resurrection's happened. The women, Mary and some of the other women, have seen Jesus. Verse 11, while the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. So the first theory that occurred back then, and people will still subscribe to it today, is that the disciples stole his body. And again, you have to have some assumptions with that if you're going to go down that route. And the first thing is how in the world did the disciples sneak past the Roman guard? Now, the story, and obviously there's insider information that's going on here, and we know that some of the priests actually converted later on in the book of Acts. So we know that there was people who either were Christians or became Christians. But how did they sneak past the guards? Well, the story is that the guards were sleeping. The guards were sleeping. And so you're telling me they had put this giant boulder at the entrance of the tomb that they, I don't know if they put pillows under the boulder, and rolled it on pillows how do you move a giant stone without waking up the guards? And you could make the argument, well, maybe they had been drinking. But look at what happens before this. Look at the previous chapters 27 and verse 62. Matthew 27, verse 62. It says, "The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. 'Sir,' they said, 'we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he's been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first.' 'Take a guard,' Pilate answered. 'Go make the tomb as secure as you know how.' So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard." Did they make the tomb as secure as they possibly could? Yeah, they did. Were the guards instructed that there might be a surprise from the disciples? Yes. I don't believe these Roman soldiers would have let their guard down. I don't think they would have gone to sleep on the job. They would have been risking their lives. But if they've been told, look, we're concerned about the disciples coming and trying to steal the body, you need to be on guard. You need to be watching. I don't think they would have relaxed during that time. They probably would have been on edge that entire weekend. So you would have to make the argument that against all odds, these Roman soldiers, these professional, have you been around professional soldiers? Do you fall asleep on the job? Dennis is saying no. You don't. They're professionals. Their job, their lives are at risk. They're not. That's not going to happen. But if you're going to go that route, you also have to make the argument. You have to come up with an argument why the disciples would even do that in the first place. Why would they make up a story about Jesus being alive? And we actually covered this last week. If you weren't here, we've got the recording on YouTube. You can go back and listen to it. But why would the disciples, people say, well, maybe they were after money or after power. But everything we know about the disciples, the early disciples, the apostles, they gave up money. They gave up power to testify to the resurrection of Jesus. They didn't go after those things at all. There's no evidence that they did. In fact, when Paul's writing we were reading 1 Thessalonians earlier in class, and Paul is telling them this. Paul writes 1 Thessalonians just weeks or months after he's been there, and he says, "Remember my way of life when I was with you. I didn't take any money from you guys. I didn't take any money." He said, "I worked night and day to make sure I had everything that I needed. So you know the life that I lived among you." And he said that was the mark of an apostle, was you had the worst life. So these guys, there's no evidence that, and you figure when Saul is going from house to house arresting Christians, you're telling me there's not one witness that caved if all these people got together to make up this story. And you're talking about dozens and dozens of people that we see in the Gospels. Paul says there was 500. You're telling me not one witness caved during that time? You're telling me that 10 years after the crucifixion, when Herod arrests James the apostle and is about to put him to death, and he's given the chance to say, all right, tell us the truth. Tell us that you made up the story. You're telling me at that point, if James had made up the story, that he's like, you know what? You got me. I don't really want to die over this. It's not worth dying for. But none of the witnesses did. They all went to their deaths proclaiming that Jesus was alive, that Jesus was resurrected. How do you explain that? Well, there's another argument that we're going to look at. Go to the book of Luke, chapter 24. Luke chapter 24. And this is probably right now in time considered the most popular argument that's made. And this might seem weird to you, but right now, probably the most popular argument to make for people who are skeptics is that the disciples had a vision. They didn't really see Jesus alive. They just thought that they did. That they had, some even will say they had a group hallucination, or that they saw his ghost. And that might sound weird, but the reason that is probably the most popular argument right now is because the more that we learn about first century Judaism, the more we realize these guys really believed it. Like these guys, these apostles, they really believed that they saw Jesus alive. Like the more that we learn about what a normal first century Jew is like, the more we understand this isn't a story they would make up. It's not a story that they would go to their deaths for. They had to have really believed it. So if you're a skeptic, you're like, okay, well, why would they really believe it? They must have thought that they saw Jesus alive. They must have had some kind of vision, they must have saw his ghost. And there are reports, where people see a loved one who's recently passed. Though, people say those kinds of things. Back then, certainly sometimes there were stories like that. There's actually a story in the book of Acts. Right after I talked about the apostle James being executed by Herod, Herod tries to execute Peter, but God rescues Peter at night when everyone's asleep. Well, Peter goes to a house where the church is at, and he's knocking on the door. And there's a little girl named Rhoda, and she's so excited. She hears Peter. She's so excited, she doesn't open the door. She goes and tells the church, Peter's outside. And what do they say? It must be his angel. Peter must be already dead. And you're just having this experience where you're seeing his ghost, or what they say his angel. So they're familiar with that as a possibility. Let's read the book of Luke in verse 36. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, peace be with you. They were startled and frightened. And Jesus is like, I said peace. They're like, ah. But what? Why? Thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. So, did Jesus have skin and bones? Were they able to touch him? I know Peter's like poking. How could you not? How could you not, reach out your hand? Like, okay, I'm going to verify, right? Was that the only thing that happened? No, look. Verse 40. When he said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, do you have anything here to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Now, can you imagine being in a room full of at least the 12, if not more people, and they're all just staring at you while you eat? If you've ever had someone stare at you while you eat, that's one of the most awkward things. So I'm thankful that Jesus did that. But Jesus proved to them, not a ghost. I've got skin and bones. I can eat. And this isn't the only time he eats with them. He eats with them again weeks later. Right? So Jesus, and obviously it was so incredible, they had a hard time believing it, which makes sense. And even at the end of Matthew, think of this. At the end of Matthew, when Jesus is talking to them at the very last time, Matthew tells us even then some of them still doubted. That's an amazing thing to say. That's kind of a shocking thing that Matthew would admit that. But that is just how incredible this experience was. It's like, can this really be true? Can this really be true? So they struggled with that, and Jesus demonstrated to them over a course of 40 days, is what Luke goes on to tell us in Acts chapter 1. Over 40 days that Jesus was with them, that he demonstrated to them that he's really alive and not just barely recovered from a crucifixion. No, he's resurrected, transformed into the glory that God has prepared for all of us someday. That's what they saw. That's what they experienced. And because of that, they went to their deaths, proclaiming Jesus is Lord. Jesus is alive. So what can we conclude? Number one, the tomb was empty. Because if they were really worried that they saw a ghost, all they had to do is go back to the tomb, right? The body would still be there. But they verified, multiple people verified the tomb is empty, and then they really saw Jesus. There's no, even among the skeptics, they conclude those things. They would say they thought they saw Jesus, but they wanted us to know for sure they found Jesus, or they saw Jesus. I just saw a text from Kelsey that they found the hiker. So we can thank God for that. We can thank God for that. And we remember it wasn't just one person who says they saw Jesus alive. We're talking about dozens of people in the Gospels. Paul says there was 500 who all shared the same story. Now, some of the details differed, right? As you would expect. If you're gathering, eyewitness testimony, that still happens today in courts. It doesn't mean that their eyewitness testimony isn't valid. It shows that it is valid. But why would we believe that a man who was executed as a criminal 2,000 years ago is alive today and is reigning over this entire world as king? If Paul and Peter were here to tell us about it, they would tell us the story. And as they told the story, if you found yourself believing that story, as ridiculous as it might seem to the rest of the world, they would say, that's the Spirit of God working on your heart, calling you into his kingdom, calling you into his family. That's the evidence that God's Spirit is calling you, if you find yourself believing that story. And so today, if you find yourself believing that story, and you haven't made the decision to give your life to Jesus, to declare that Jesus is Lord, to be united with him in baptism, in his death and his resurrection, why would you wait? Why would you wait? If you're here and if you have been living separated from God and you need to come back to God, we want to be the family that brings you back to God. If you're needing prayers or encouragement, if you're struggling, we want to be the family that lifts you up in prayer and encouragement, that walks with you. Because, we're not meant to do this life alone, are we? We're just sheep, as Jesus says. And what kind of sheep are we? Dumb sheep. Yeah. So we got to stay with the flock, and we got to follow our shepherd. And our Father in heaven will lead us to that goal. Well, if you